My mother has a favorite sentence, and she likes to remind me of it roughly once a week. Giving birth to me, she says, was the worst decision she ever made in her life. She usually leads with it before she's even finished, taking her shoes off at the door, which tells you everything you need to know about how these visits tend to go. This particular morning was her third visit of the month, which was impressive considering the month wasn't even close to over. I sat on the edge of my bed, shoulders slumped, staring at a spot on the floor that had suddenly become very interesting, while she stood over me listing out, once again, everything my older brother had accomplished by the time he was my age. He'd started his own company before he turned 20. He'd stopped taking a single cent from our parents the day he enrolled in university. He apparently did all of this while also being taller, more charming, and I'm fairly sure this part was implied rather than said out loud, a better son in every conceivable way. I want to be clear that I did try. I put together my own startup a year ago, under fairly different circumstances than she probably remembers, and poured every yuan of savings I had into it. 6 months in, it collapsed under a string of losses I never quite managed to recover from. My father's reaction to that particular failure was to slap me across the face in a moment I still haven't fully processed. My brother's reaction was to remind me, once again, exactly why he was the one everyone pointed to when they talked about our family. Here's the thing nobody tells you about failure. Though it doesn't get remembered kindly, success gets celebrated. Failure just becomes material people use against you later, which is exactly what was happening in my bedroom at 8 in the morning. Months after the fact, like the wound needed reopening on a schedule. You used to be obedient at least, she said, glancing at the small collection of medals still sitting on my shelf. Archery, piano, a handful of academic competitions I'd been pushed into as a kid. That obedience got you results. I used to play piano. I don't have the energy for it anymore. As for archery, I don't get a lot of chances these days to demonstrate how precisely I could put an arrow through someone's eye, though, in that particular moment, the idea had a certain appeal. Kyle, her voice sharpened. When exactly are you going to stop being so irresponsible? Just give me a date, and I'll stop wasting my time coming here. I looked up and met her eyes, the same piercing blue I apparently inherited and did nothing useful with, and said, "Give it 50 years. Though I'm not sure you'll still be around to see it." That earned me a look like she was seriously considering slapping the taste out of my mouth, so I grabbed my phone and my bag before she could follow through on it. "I'm running late." "Lock the door on your way out," I told her, and then I was out the front door and moving fast enough that I couldn't hear whatever she shouted after me. I want it on record that I'm not actually as nonchalant about my life as she thinks I am. I worry about it constantly. It's just that, unlike my brother, my parents' obvious favorite in every sense of the word, I don't have a single thing about me that qualifies as exceptional. Every one of those medals on my shelf existed because they pushed me into competing, not because I ever wanted to. And the whole reason I moved out on my own in the first place was to stop living my life as a slightly worse copy of his. I'd told myself I would never ask my parents for money again after I moved out. That lasted about as long as my savings did. These days, my monthly allowance comes specifically from my brother, who never misses an opportunity to hand it over with a reminder attached about exactly how different the two of us turned out to be. She left without another word after that, and I sat there for a while longer than I needed to, listening to the front door click shut And then, a few seconds later, locked from the outside. She'd actually done it. Out of habit more than kindness, I assumed. I've noticed that about disappointment. It doesn't announce itself once, and then leave you alone. It circles back on a schedule, dressed up as concern, and somehow every visit manages to find a slightly new angle to come at you from. This time it had been the metals. Last time it had been my apartment's location, too far from a good neighborhood, apparently a reflection of my choices rather than my budget. I'd stopped trying to guess what the next one would be. I walked to campus that morning instead of taking the bus, partly because my bus card had been stolen a few weeks back, and partly because paying for a new one felt like a bigger ask than my dignity could currently absorb. Arthur's Academic Union isn't a particularly prestigious school, but it's enough. If I actually graduate, it should be enough to get me a job that lets me eat 3 meals a day without thinking too hard about it. That was the plan, anyway, on the good days. I've never been able to decide whether the walk to campus was the best or the worst part of my day. Best, because it was the only 20 minutes where nobody expected anything from me at all. No comparisons, no disappointed looks, no notifications I was afraid to check. Worst, because it gave me exactly enough time to think, and thinking, for me, rarely led anywhere good. That particular morning, I mostly thought about numbers. Bank balance. Days left before rent. The precise dollar amount my brother's transfer covered, and the precise amount of humiliation that came bundled with it, free of charge. Campus was its usual noisy self by the time I got there. Clusters of students laughing, trading gossip, existing in that easy, unbothered way I never quite figured out how to do myself. I'm not a total outcast. People wave. People smile. I'm just the kind of person everyone knows, and nobody specifically invites anywhere, which is its own particular flavor of loneliness that's hard to explain to someone who's never lived inside it. I was looking for one specific person as I made my way through the hallway. My girlfriend, Amanda, who I fully expected to be late, because she'd been late meeting me for the better part of 6 months now. I checked my phone on the way to my seat, a message I'd sent her the night before, asking if we could meet at the station at 7. Sent at 9. Still unread. This had become a pattern I'd started noticing, without wanting to admit I was noticing it. Replies that never came. Calls that got disconnected the second they rang. Half-explained excuses about her mother needing her. I told myself it was nothing. I'd been telling myself that for a while. Amanda and I had been together for 2 years by that point, and for most of it, things had actually been good. She was the one who'd approached me first, back when I was nobody in particular. Which, to be fair, I still am, and somehow that hadn't scared her off. We were friends for a few weeks before she confessed to me, and I said yes without much hesitation because I liked her, and because being wanted by someone, for the first time in my life, did something to me that I probably don't need to explain. For a while, she was the best thing that had happened to me. She was the one who pushed me to actually try the startup in the first place, who believed in it before I did, who acted like a mother, a friend, and a girlfriend, all at once depending on what the day called for. Then the business collapsed, and my father hit me, and my brother said what he always says, and somewhere in the wreckage of that, right around the same 6-month mark I kept losing count of, Amanda started drifting, leaving early, skipping our nights together, walking out of class without a goodbye, and texting an excuse an hour later. I tried everything I could think of to fix it. I kept texting even when she stopped replying. I left notes for her. 2 months ago, I'd planned something big for her birthday, something I'd actually saved up for, and she never showed. Her excuse was that her aunt had fallen down a flight of stairs and needed her right away. I remembered, distinctly, a conversation from early in our relationship where she'd told me she only had one aunt, and that aunt lived in a different country entirely. I hadn't said anything about it at the time. I'd just filed it away, the way you file away small cracks before the wall actually comes down. Looking back, I think some part of me had already known for weeks before that morning. You don't spend 2 years with someone without learning the specific shape of their honesty, and Amanda's had started sounding different, a half-beat too rehearsed, a little too eager to end the conversation before it could go anywhere real. I just hadn't let myself finish the thought. There's a strange kind of comfort in unfinished thoughts. As long as you don't finish them, you get to keep living in the version of your life where they aren't true yet. Around me, the usual pre-class chatter was in full swing. Most of it centered on the one guy every girl on this campus seemed collectively obsessed with, Ethan Lockhart, the kind of effortlessly charming golden boy who made every other man on campus, myself included, functionally invisible by comparison. I sat down, phone still in hand, staring at that unread message, while the professor started asking everyone to get their notes out for the day. I wasn't really listening. My head was somewhere else entirely. And then, a little late, two people came rushing through the classroom door together. One of them was Ethan. The other one was Amanda. They looked at each other for exactly the kind of beat too long to be nothing. Our eyes met across the room for maybe 2 seconds before I looked away first, because I already knew, with a kind of sick, immediate clarity, exactly what I was looking at. I didn't need her to explain the 6 months of silence anymore, or the aunt who apparently existed in 2 places at once. I had my answer sitting right there in the doorway. I spent the rest of that class period taking exactly 0 notes, staring at a board I couldn't have described 5 seconds after looking away from it. The professor eventually noticed. I caught her glancing at me once, twice, in a way that felt more curious than annoyed, though I didn't have the mental bandwidth to think about it. When the bell finally rang, she reminded the class about an upcoming research trip and told us, half joking, not to fake a dead relative just to get out of it. I almost laughed. It felt darkly appropriate given the excuse currently sitting 3 rows over. Everyone started packing up around me. I stayed in my seat and waited, because I already knew what I needed to do, and I wasn't going to let another day pass pretending otherwise. I watched Ethan glance back, not at me, at the group of girls behind me, Amanda's group, and 2 of them peeled off to join him. One stayed behind and walked over to where I was sitting. Amanda sat down beside me with the same ocean blue eyes and soft black hair I used to think I could look at for hours. She apologized for missing my text, blamed a dentist appointment and a missed train. I didn't say anything. She seemed to expect an outburst from me. I'd been getting sharper with people lately, though mostly the sharpness landed on myself rather than anyone else. After a pause, she said she needed to go finish an assignment at the library with the others, and that she'd call me that night. "You don't need to," I said before she could get up. I gathered my books while she stood there, confused. "You don't need to call me anymore, Amanda." She blinked. I watched the tension creep across her face in real time. "What do you mean, Kyle?" I looked straight at her and said it plainly, because 2 years deserved at least that much honesty. "I mean, we're breaking up." so don't call me again. Something odd happened just before that exchange, though it took me a while afterward to realize how strange it actually was. Earlier, on my way out of the lecture hall, the same professor who'd been glancing at me all period had stopped me and asked, almost too casually, if I was doing all right. Teachers ask that kind of question without meaning much by it most of the time, but there was something in how she said it, like she already suspected the answer wasn't going to be yes, and wanted to hear it confirmed anyway. I told her I was fine. She held my gaze a beat longer than the answer really called for before letting me go. I filed it away with everything else I wasn't ready to think about yet. I didn't stick around for whatever Amanda said next. I don't fully remember walking home that evening, only that by the time I got there, I sat down on the floor of my apartment with my back against the bed and did the kind of brutally honest inventory of my life I'd been avoiding for months. 20 years old, a failed startup behind me, a father who'd hit me once already, and a brother who never let a monthly transfer go by without a comment attached. A mother who visited 3 times a month, specifically to remind me what a disappointment I was. And now, officially, no girlfriend, having just confirmed in the most humiliating way possible that she'd already left months before she got around to admitting it out loud. The only thing left standing, barely, was my streaming channel, a small, mostly ignored corner of the internet where a few dozen regulars showed up to watch me talk into a camera about nothing in particular. It wasn't much. It had never been much. But it was the one thing I'd started entirely on my own terms, without anyone pushing me into it, and somewhere in the wreckage of that day, I decided it was time to let that go too. Cut my losses across the board. Stop pretending any of it was going anywhere. I sat in front of that laptop for a long time before I actually pressed the button to go live. It's a strange thing, quitting something nobody was really paying attention to in the first place. There's no ceremony to it. No one throws you a going-away party for a hobby with 20 regular viewers. I almost talked myself out of even announcing it, just letting the channel go dark and assuming nobody would notice for a month or two. But some stubborn, wounded part of me wanted to say it out loud, to at least one audience, even a small one, before I let it go the way I'd let everything else go that year. I opened my laptop that night, turned on the camera, and started what I fully intended to be my last stream. I don't remember exactly what I said. Something honest, probably too honest, about being tired of failing quietly, tired of being compared to a brother who never had to try this hard for anything, tired of finding out in a lecture hall that the person I trusted most had already left months before she officially left. I told the 20 or so people watching that this was it. Last stream. Thanks for showing up when nobody else really did. The reaction wasn't what I expected. My chat, usually a slow trickle of lukewarm comments, exploded. People typing over each other, telling me not to quit, asking what happened, a few of them clearly upset in a way that caught me off guard, given how small and quiet this channel had always been. And then, in the middle of all that noise, one of my regulars, someone who'd been watching for months, always polite, always a little strange in a way I'd never quite been able to place, sent a gift. Not a normal one. Not the kind of small digital token people usually send. The second it landed, something shifted, immediately and physically, like the temperature in the room had changed, even though nothing around me had actually moved. What followed is difficult to explain cleanly, because at the time it didn't feel explainable at all. I understood, all at once and with a certainty I couldn't argue with, that the world was not what I'd spent 20 years assuming it was. Somewhere underneath the version of reality I'd grown up in, there was another one, older, stranger, populated by things with names like nightmare and shadow and ghoul and curse, entities that weren't metaphors or horror movie set dressing but simply real, and had apparently been real the entire time, quietly coexisting with the mundane life I thought I'd been failing at. And that gift, that one impossible gift from a regular viewer I'd never thought twice about, had just made me a part of it. I felt something settle into place inside me that I can only describe as a kind of blessing, though it didn't come with fireworks or a booming voice from the heavens. It was quieter than that, more like a switch being flipped somewhere I didn't know I had. Along with it came something even stranger, a system, invisible but unmistakably present, that seemed to exist for the sole purpose of rewarding me, not for winning anything, not for accomplishing some grand task, just for existing, continuing to exist the way I'd been doing badly at for 20 straight years. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to piece together the next part. Some of the regular viewers on my stream, the ones I'd always assumed were just people, ordinary, bored strangers clicking into a small, unremarkable channel, were not people at all. They were something closer to gods. They'd been watching me, apparently, for longer than I knew, in the exact same understated way they'd been sending small gifts and typing encouraging comments in my chat, never once giving away what they actually were. I sat there in my apartment that night, laptop still open, stream long since ended, trying to process the fact that the single worst day of my life, public humiliation, a shattered relationship confirmed dead on arrival, a mother's voice still ringing in my ears about what a disappointment I was, had somehow also become the night everything about my life quietly, irreversibly changed. Rock bottom, it turned out, had a trapdoor in it I never knew was there. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the silence of my apartment settle back in around me, half expecting the feeling to fade the way adrenaline usually does once the initial shock wears off. It didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened, a low, steady hum somewhere behind my ribs that hadn't been there an hour earlier, like a second heartbeat had quietly moved in without asking permission. I didn't understand yet what any of this actually meant. I didn't know what an SSS rank was, or why that particular classification kept surfacing in my head like something I'd always known but never had a reason to access before. I didn't know what my first skill would look like, or how a system built around simply existing was supposed to function differently from every hero fantasy story I'd half read as a teenager, where power always came from grinding, from winning, from being chosen for some grand destiny I clearly wasn't. All I knew was that something in my chest felt lighter than it had in months, in a way that had nothing to do with the breakup or the business, or my father's hand, or my brother's voice. What I did know, sitting there in the dark with my chat log still glowing on the screen, replies from strangers who might not have been strangers at all, was that the version of me who'd walked home that afternoon, convinced his life was quietly ending. That version of me didn't exist anymore. Whatever I was now, I hadn't earned it. I hadn't trained for it, competed for it, been pushed into it by anyone. For the first time in longer than I could remember, something had simply been given to me, unconditionally, for no better reason than the fact that I'd kept showing up week after week to a stream almost nobody watched. I sat with that thought for a long time. 20 years of being told, in one way or another, that I was the disappointing one, the son who didn't measure up, the boyfriend who wasn't enough to keep, the founder whose company didn't survive its first year. And somewhere in the middle of the worst single day I could remember having, something in the universe had apparently decided otherwise. I didn't trust it yet. I want to be honest about that. Part of me was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this to turn out to be some cruel cosmic joke at the expense of a guy who'd already had a rough enough day without a supernatural twist added on top. But another part of me, smaller and quieter, had started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I'd been measuring myself by the wrong scale this entire time. I closed my laptop that night without any real idea what tomorrow was going to look like. My mother would probably still think I was a disappointment. My brother would probably still remind me of the gap between us the next time he transferred my allowance. Amanda and Ethan would probably still be exactly what I now knew they'd already become, whether either of them said it out loud or not. None of that had changed. But somewhere underneath all of it, quietly, invisibly, something entirely new had just started keeping score, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one losing. I didn't sleep, not really. I lay on top of my blanket instead of under it, staring at a ceiling I'd looked at 1,000 times before and had never once found interesting, and for once my mind wasn't circling the usual loop. Rent, my mother's voice, the look on Amanda's face in that doorway. It had something new to chew on instead. I kept waiting for that low hum behind my ribs to fade, the way you wait for a loud noise to stop ringing in your ears, and it never did. If anything, lying still made it easier to notice. It wasn't unpleasant. It was more like discovering a room in your own apartment you'd somehow never opened the door to, and finding out it had been furnished the whole time. At some point past 3 in the morning, more out of restlessness than any real expectation that something would happen, I said quietly to the empty room, "Status." I don't know why that was the word that came out. It wasn't a word I'd ever used out loud in my life. But something in the back of my head had supplied it the way you'd remember a phone number you didn't know you'd memorized, and the second I said it, something answered. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. Nothing so dramatic as a booming announcement or a mechanical narrator reading out my flaws. It was closer to a thought that wasn't mine appearing fully formed in my head, the way you sometimes hear a sentence you're about to type before your hands catch up to it. A pane of information, if I can even call it that, unfolded somewhere behind my eyes rather than in front of them. My name. My age. A rank listed where I'd have expected nothing to be listed at all, because ranks were the sort of thing that belonged to fictional heroes, not to a 20-year-old, with a dead startup and a stolen bus card. I stared at that rank for what felt like a very long time. I want to be honest and say I didn't fully understand what it meant yet, not the scale of it, not what separated an SSS from whatever came under it, not why a system like this would bother handing something so enormous to someone who'd spent the entire day getting quietly dismantled by everyone who was supposed to love him. All I understood in that moment was that it existed, and that it was mine, and that nobody had voted on it, negotiated for it, or decided I'd earned it through some trial I'd passed without noticing. It had simply been given. That part kept snagging on something in me. 20 years of my life had been organized around the idea that nothing worth having ever just arrives. You compete for it, you're chosen for it, or you go without. And here was proof, sitting quietly in my own head at 3 in the morning, that the rule had at least one exception, and the exception was me. I asked it more questions after that, mostly out of the same restless curiosity, that used to get me in trouble as a kid poking at things I'd been told not to touch. Some of it answered plainly. Some of it stayed frustratingly vague, the way a locked door stays a locked door no matter how politely you ask it to open. I got the distinct impression. I couldn't have told you exactly why, only that the impression was there, solid and unshakable. That this wasn't a system built for grinding levels or fighting monsters in some parallel dungeon, the way the handful of half-finished web novels I'd read as a teenager always assumed. It felt built around something smaller and stranger, showing up, continuing, doing the unglamorous, uncelebrated work of simply not quitting, the exact thing I'd tried and failed to do earlier that very night before a stranger's gift had talked me out of it. There was a section, half-formed and clearly not finished unlocking yet, that I understood, again, in that same wordless, absorbed rather than read way, to be tied directly to my streaming, not to views. Not to money, though the platform certainly tracked both of those too, same as it always had. To something closer to authenticity, if I had to put a word to it. The system seemed to care, in whatever capacity a system can be said to care about anything. Whether the thing I put in front of a camera was real. Every live stream it suggested, without quite spelling it out in full, was a kind of event now. Not background noise I ran in the margins of a life that was otherwise falling apart, but an actual sight of something happening, the way a stage is, a sight of something happening the second the lights come up, regardless of how few or many people are sitting in the audience. I thought about the 20 or so regulars in my chat that night, the ones who'd exploded into a wall of text the second I said I was quitting. I thought about the one who'd sent the gift. I ran back through months of stream history in my head, trying to remember which username it had been, and came up mostly blank. I'd never been the kind of streamer who memorized his audience, mostly because I'd never believed I had an audience worth memorizing. That felt like it was going to have to change, and probably soon. Morning came without my noticing the transition from night to it, the way it does when you never actually fall asleep, so much as drift somewhere adjacent to sleep and back out again. I got up off the floor. I'd migrated there at some point without registering the decision, with a stiffness in my back that had nothing supernatural about it at all, which felt almost funny given everything else. Whatever had changed in me overnight, it apparently hadn't come with an upgrade to how my spine handled 8 hours on hardwood. I checked my phone out of habit before I'd even fully processed being awake. Nothing from Amanda. I hadn't expected anything, and I noted, with something that surprised me by how little it hurt, that I genuinely didn't mind the silence this time. There was a message from my brother instead, the monthly transfer, arriving a few days early with its usual attached commentary about responsible spending, as if I were a teenager who needed reminding not to blow rent money on something frivolous. I read it twice, the way I always did, waiting for the familiar sting to show up. It was there, but smaller than usual, like a bruise that had mostly finished healing overnight instead of one freshly pressed. I went to campus that day mostly on autopilot, the same 20-minute walk I'd made 1,000 times, except that for the first time, in longer than I could remember, I wasn't spending the whole walk doing the math on my bank account. I was thinking about the pain of information sitting quietly behind my eyes, wondering how much of what I'd seen the night before I'd actually understood correctly, and how much I'd half-invented out of shock and sleep deprivation. Rank, skill, status, words that belonged in games, not in the life of a business major, with a stolen bus card and a mother who called giving birth to him her worst decision. I kept expecting the whole thing to evaporate in daylight, the way half-remembered dreams usually do the second sunlight hits your face. It didn't evaporate. If anything, walking helped it settle in further, the same low hum behind my ribs, keeping pace with my footsteps the entire way there. Nobody on campus looked at me differently, which I registered as strange, only because some small, unreasonable part of me had half expected they would, as if a night like the one I'd just had should leave some visible mark, the way a bad haircut or a black eye announces itself before you've said a word. Nothing had changed on the outside. I still walked past the same clusters of laughing students who waved without inviting me anywhere. I still caught out of the corner of my eye the particular knot of people orbiting Ethan Lockhart near the courtyard, and somewhere in that knot, unmistakably, Amanda's soft black hair. I felt something when I saw her. Not nothing. I wasn't going to pretend it was nothing. But it sat differently than it had the day before, smaller and quieter, like a wound that had already started scabbing over faster than a normal wound should. I didn't know yet whether that was the system's doing, or just what a good night's revelation does to a person's priorities. I decided it didn't matter which. Either way, I kept walking, and I didn't look back a second time. Class that day passed, the way classes tend to when your mind is somewhere else entirely. And by the time I got home that evening, I didn't hesitate the way I had the night before. I opened my laptop, and for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, I felt something close to anticipation instead of dread sitting down in front of that camera. My chat filled in faster than it ever had. Word travels fast among 20 regulars when one of them watched their favorite small streamer announce his retirement, and then hours later quietly unannounce it without much explanation. I didn't tell them what had actually happened. I wasn't sure yet how I'd even begin to explain it, or whether saying it out loud to strangers on the internet would make it more real or somehow less. I just told them I'd changed my mind, thanked them again for showing up when it mattered, and started talking, the same way I always had, about nothing in particular. Except it wasn't quite the same. I noticed it almost immediately, a kind of ease in my own voice I hadn't had the night before, a willingness to actually look into the camera instead of somewhere just past it. Partway through the stream, doing nothing more dramatic than answering a viewer's question about my day, I felt that same low hum behind my ribs shift, briefly, into something sharper, almost like a held breath being released. A small notification unfurled behind my eyes, the way the status pane had the night before, except this one was shorter, cleaner, unmistakably new. I didn't say anything about it out loud. I just sat there for half a second too long, chat asking if I'd frozen, while I quietly absorbed the fact that the system hadn't been speaking in hypotheticals. It really did seem to reward the stream itself, the act of it, the honesty of it, and not the numbers scrolling past on the side of my screen. I ended that stream later than I meant to, and for the first time in months, I went to bed that night without doing the usual inventory of everything wrong with my life. There was still plenty wrong with it, if I'd gone looking. My mother hadn't stopped being my mother. My brother hadn't stopped being my brother. Amanda and Ethan hadn't stopped being whatever they'd already become behind my back for longer than I wanted to think about. None of that had been erased by a status pane and a stranger's gift. But something underneath all of it had shifted its center of gravity, quietly, and without asking permission, the same way it had the night before. And for the second night in a row, I fell asleep without dreading what tomorrow was going to take from me. Looking back on that stretch of days later, I think what actually changed wasn't the rank, or the status pane, or even the vague promise of a skill waiting somewhere just out of reach. It was smaller than that, and harder to put a name to. For 20 years, every measure of my worth had been handed to me by somebody else. My mother's disappointment, my father's hand, my brother's monthly transfer with its attached commentary, Amanda's slow, quiet withdrawal that I'd spent months pretending not to notice. I had never once been the one keeping score. And then, on the single worst day I could remember living through, something had reached past every one of those voices and decided, without consulting a single one of them, that I was worth investing in. I didn't know yet what that would eventually cost me, or who else out there, human or otherwise, had been quietly watching long before that gift ever landed in my chat. I didn't know how many more nights like that one were coming, each one peeling back another layer of a world I'd spent 20 years walking through without ever suspecting it had a second floor. All I knew, lying there in the dark with a system humming quietly behind my ribs, was that the version of me who used to sit on the edge of his bed absorbing his mother's disappointment before breakfast, that version wasn't gone, not completely. He was still in there, still flinching a little every time his phone buzzed with his brother's name on it. But for the first time in as long as I could remember, he wasn't alone in there anymore. Something had finally shown up on his side of the ledger, and whatever came next, he wasn't going to let it go without a fight this time.